In 1821, a man arrived in Great Britain with news and an opportunity. He claimed to be the newly made cazique of a wonderful land called Poyais. He was a Scotsman, a military officer, and a hero of the South American rebellions against the Spanish Empire. He was seeking investors and colonists. He was selling land at attractive prices and floating loans with bonds that were signed Gregor I, sovereign prince of the independent state of Poyais. Many people were all too happy to hand over their money and property in exchange for land in this promised paradise. There was only one problem. It was all a lie.
The man who arrived in England in 1821 already had a long career of misrepresentation behind him. Born in Scotland in 1786, Gregor MacGregor was a member of Clan Gregor, which had only recently been reinstated after more than 150 years of proscription. Gregor began a military career at the age of 16 in 1803 with a purchased commission as an ensign in the 57th Regiment of Foot. While with the regiment, he married Maria Bowater, a member of a wealthy and distinguished family. He quickly reached lieutenant rank and purchased his captain rank. He was not, however, popular. As a company commander, he was not well liked because of an obsession with extreme affectation of dress and fashion. He briefly accompanied the 57th to Spain during the Peninsular War, but had left under uncertain but likely embarrassing circumstances before the 57th made a name for themselves as the Diehards at the Battle of Albuera in May 1811. On his return to England, he would make a variety of false claims, including that he was a baronet and had succeeded to the clan chieftainship. Maria died suddenly in December 1811. Without his wife's money, he had few prospects, but opportunity presented itself. Venezuela had declared independence in July, and Venezuelan General Francisco de Miranda had recently been to London, where he was widely honored. MacGregor sold his father's estate and arrived in Venezuela in 1812, just after an earthquake leveled Caracas. Claiming to be a knight of the Portuguese Order of Christ, as well as a member of the Diehards, he was given command of a cavalry battalion and made a colonel. He made a name for himself in his first engagement when he routed a royalist force. Later that year, he married a second time to Josefa Lovera, a cousin of Simon Bolivar. He spent the next decade hopping between revolutionary armies. In New Granada, an official complained that he was sick of this bluffer or Quixote or the devil knows what. But he was present at numerous battles. He gained his greatest fame in a successful and fraught 34-day retreat through the jungle. Bolivar wrote that the retreat was, in my opinion, superior to the conquest of an empire. Bolivar presented him personally with the Order of Liberators. MacGregor then made a detour, raising forces in the United States and capturing Amelia Island, a small island off the coast of Spanish Florida. He declared himself leader of the Republic of the Floridas, invented the chivalric Order of the Green Cross, and then abandoned the island as the Spanish prepared a force to retake it, leaving his men behind. That didn't stop him from striking commemorative medallions in the Bahamas bearing the inscription, Amelia Veni Vidi Vici. Amelia, I came, I saw, I conquered. He twice more abandoned his troops at key moments. After raising a force in Britain, he used it to capture the Spanish stronghold of Portobello in Panama without a shot in April 1819. His leadership was poor, however, and he failed to put out sentries. His men were surprised when the Spanish marched into the port. MacGregor barely escaped. Most of his men did not. He successfully captured Rio de la Hacha in September and declared himself His Majesty the Inca of New Granada. Again, he abandoned his troops when the Spanish gathered to attack. By then, he was persona non grata in much of the New World. He was wanted in Jamaica for piracy, and Bolivar had ordered that he be hanged if he ever saw him again. Michael Rafter, who had survived the ill-fated Rio de la Hacha fiasco, published the highly critical biography Memoirs of Gregor MacGregor in June 1820. After MacGregor's many failures, Rafter thought that it was impossible that anyone could be foolish enough to follow him in his desperate projects. Rafter, however, had spoken too soon. MacGregor reappeared in 1820, this time on the Mosquito Coast, today mostly in Honduras. The coast, while nominally claimed by Spain, had never been occupied and enjoyed independence. It had been a haven for British and French privateers and pirates over the centuries, because don't all good stories involve pirates? Sparsely populated and heavily forested, it was a beautiful but not especially productive land for European settlement. The local Mosquito people had signed a treaty of friendship and alliance with the British in 1740, and the British maintained several small settlements there, including St. Joseph at the mouth of the Black River, until a 1786 agreement required them to abandon it. In 1816, King George Frederick Augustus I, returning from exile in Jamaica, was crowned in Belize. The king was not a king in a European sense, holding sway over only a part of the population, and that not complete. In April of 1820, MacGregor met the king at Cape Gracias a Dio, or Cape Thank God, and received a title to 12,500 square miles of country in trade for rum and jewelry. MacGregor claimed that he was given the title cazique, a Spanish word for native chief, and he called himself a prince. He named his new land Poyais, after the local Poya or Paya people, today called the Peak. With his supposed title and land grant secured, he sailed back to England. Despite his many failures and the book denouncing him, the public in England did not know widely of his failures, but remembered his successes: the fabulous retreat in Venezuela, his heroic connection to the diehards, and his ancestor, Rob Roy MacGregor, popularized in a novel by Sir Walter Scott in 1817. His association with the famed General Francisco de Miranda, who was still well remembered and well connected in London, was valuable as well. The situation in South America was in such flux that the arrival of a British officer claiming to have been made a prince of a new nation didn't seem improbable. His wife, referred to as the Princess of Poyais, was exotic, reserved, and beautiful, bringing MacGregor only more attention. By the winter of 1821, they were living grandly with Major William John Richardson, an influential man that MacGregor named charge d'affaires of the Poyais legation in England, as well as major in the Poyais Royal Regiment of Horse Guards. He claimed to have come to England on behalf of his people to attend the coronation of George IV and to encourage immigration. He also claimed that his country had been well established already by earlier British settlement, and that it had a civil service and a rudimentary army. He produced a fantastic proclamation, he says he distributed to the inhabitants of the territory of Poyais, dated April 13, 1821, endorsed as a true copy of the original by Thomas Strangeways, aide-de-camp and captive 1st Native Poyais Regiment. He wrote that he was leaving for England to procure your religious and moral instructions and persons to guide and assist you in cultivating the country's natural riches. Strangeways, however, seems to have been invented and was possibly MacGregor himself. MacGregor's legation had two goals: encourage immigration and raise funds. They met influential people at Richardson's home, and MacGregor outlined his new nation's government, which would have a tricameral legislature. He claimed that the town of St. Joseph, though abandoned by the British, remained an elegant capital, complete with a theater. Colonists wouldn't be making clearings in a jungle, but joining an already thriving country. Despite the name, he assured them that there were no mosquitoes there. MacGregor also claimed that the Poyais colony was in part meant to make up for the disastrous Scottish attempt to colonize the Darien Gap in Panama in the 1690s. He claimed one of his own ancestors had survived the fiasco. To that end, and owing to his Scottish heritage, recruitment was especially heavy in Scotland. A map and land certificates were drawn up. Ultimately, he offered the land at only 2 shillings and 3 pence an acre, so affordable that even lower echelons of skilled workers would be able to afford grants. He offered government contracts to unskilled workers and even domestic servants, with promised allotments of land. MacGregor heavily advertised the land. The Times reported that His Highness was excessively civil, and the reporter learned of the enlightened conditions in His Highness's dominions. Advertisements abounded, and he even had ballads written about the country. The growing effort, however, needed a lot of money. He needed a loan, and as London had become the greatest financial center in the world, he could get it. He just needed someone to underwrite the debt in the form of bonds, which would be repaid by future Poyasian revenue. There was likely no better time in history to offer bonds tied to a Latin American country. The British were highly interested in getting a piece of the wealth of South America, and the collapse of the Spanish Empire offered them a tantalizing opportunity. The British were certain that the newly minted states would be wealthy. The Quarterly Review pointed out that South America presents a market for the skill and expertise of our merchants. MacGregor reached out widely, including sending a letter to the Rothschilds, offering them the opportunity of a Hebrew settlement. The London Stock Exchange had only become successful after 1800, but stock trading and bets on price fluctuations was a growing field. Investing in nations was only a recent trend, but New World states soon saw it as a means of raising money. Colombia offered a £2 million issue in March 1822 with an incredible 6% interest. It was instantly successful. Soon Chile followed suit, as did Peru, despite none of these countries being officially recognized by the British government. Poyais was unique in that it had no history of conflict with Spain, and Spain presumably had no interest in reconquering it. That also meant its financial prospects were unknown, but MacGregor was determined to inform. An ad in the Glasgow Sentinel read that the soil is extremely rich and fertile, bearing 3 crops of Indian corn in a year. It was a land of plenty. Horses, cattle, deer, and poultry abounded, as did turtle, especially the species denominated hacksbill, so much prized in Europe. Even more incredible, the rivers produced natural globules of pure gold. Why had the Spanish not taken advantage? This country, the ads claimed, is indeed so completely defended by nature that any hostile attempt against it are impracticable. Thank goodness MacGregor had conquered it peacefully. His marketing efforts culminated in a book of several hundred pages, Sketch of the Mosquito Shore by Thomas Strangeways. It was supposedly a practical guide extolling the virtues of Poyais, established beyond the shadow of a doubt. St. Joseph's Harbor could hold 15 warships and 100 sail of transports besides, it claimed. Mahogany trees were in abundance and could be sold at a tidy profit only a short distance away in Belize. The book contained exhaustive financial estimates, which promised that a 640-acre sugar plantation could make profits between £655 and £1,200 a year. A cotton mill, Strangeways claimed, promised millions in profit. It seemed like a sure bet. Soon land was selling at 4 shillings an acre. MacGregor began chartering ships, procuring provisions, and arranging for departure. The first ship MacGregor found was the Honduras Packet. It would leave London in September 1822 with 70 immigrants and supplies. Government positions were also filled, and an officer named Hector Hall was made lieutenant governor of the town and district of St. Joseph, and made Baron Tinto. As the packet left port, it did so with a chest of 5,000 banknotes of Poyais dollars. The second ship, Kinnersley Castle, would launch from Leith shortly after. The immigrants happily exchanged their gold for Poyaisian dollars. Poyais issued bonds worth only £200,000 sterling, a small loan compared to the other South American issues. The issues were first offered in October 1822. It promised to be successful, but the winds changed. Issues by the other South American nations came under scrutiny, and there were rumors that the loan issue for Colombia wasn't even valid. Trading slumped. Traders lost heavily as investors stopped buying. For all the propaganda and the insurances made by MacGregor, reality was a slap to the face when the first immigrants began arriving in Poyais. When Kinnersley Castle arrived at what was supposed to be St. Joseph, they found the harbor empty. Couldn't find a town at all. The earlier Honduras packet passengers were living in tents and confirmed their fears. There was no settlement at Black River at all. Colonel Hall was absent. He was traveling to Cape Gracias a Dios, hoping to get help from His Mosquito Majesty, as the original grant put it. Most of the immigrants had nothing to return to. They had brought their families and sold everything to make the trip. James Hastie, a Scottish sawyer, wrote that the laborers were, from the very first, both lazy and regardless. The immigrants struggled to organize themselves to hunt the plentiful game or to build shelter. Hastie was shocked at the indolence. Great discontent began to exist, Hastie wrote. Hall, when he returned, had nothing in hand. The king didn't even know the settlers were coming. Hastie claims that Hall then abandoned any pretense of leadership. They could build no shelter with the pine trees, which are so full of resin they sank in the river. It seemed to be the will of Providence that every circumstance should combine for our destruction, Hastie wrote. Hall would leave for the Cape twice more, hoping to find escape. It was becoming clear that they would not survive the rainy season without shelter or supplies. Indeed, some of the settlers were elderly, having been led to believe their farms would be staffed by native labor. Civil servants, like the manager of the National Bank of Poyais, had expected to find a city, and when they didn't, they lost all direction. It seemed as if everyone was for his own hand, Hastie said. One man, the official shoemaker to the princess, committed suicide rather than face the disappointment. The colonists fell sick, and the strongest among them stole and hoarded supplies. In April, 8 people died. Hall left a third time to find assistance at the Cape. Finally, Mexican Eagle, a British ship from Belize, was sighted. The British men aboard, including Marshal Bennett, the chief magistrate of Belize, were shocked to find the settlers. They were skeptical that the Mosquito King had the authority to grant the land to MacGregor and had never heard of Cazique of Poyais. Bennett's advice was to leave immediately. Hall arrived shortly after with the Mosquito King himself. According to one survivor, the king revoked the grant, infuriated that MacGregor had made himself sovereign. He had granted no title, and MacGregor had no right to sell the land. The king demanded they either leave or swear fealty to him. failing which, Hasty added, he would bring down a strong force and massacre every man of us. So they left. 60 people boarded the Eagle, with promises to send ships back for the others. The ordeal was not over. Arriving in Belize, weak and sick, the settlers began to die in large numbers. The superintendent of Belize, Major General Edward Codd, began an investigation to lay open the true situation of the imaginary state of Poyais and to publicize the suffering of the victims. He sent a message to England to halt more ships coming to Poyais, too late to stop at least 5 more ships, which had to be intercepted. Codd's report was ultimately toothless, despite around 180 people dying. Hasty lost 2 of his 3 children. Fewer than 50 of more than 250 settlers ever returned to England. Hasty returned in October 1823, where things were getting heated for Sir MacGregor. The Lord Mayor was investigating MacGregor's loan issue, and after speaking to Hasty, the whole fiasco was soon plastered on every newspaper in the country. The mayor declared the whole scheme a complete humbug. Perhaps astonishingly, Hasty and several others actually defended MacGregor, writing that he never took money from us, never told us that we should find a theater in St. Joseph, and that they believed MacGregor was used by Colonel Hall. Hall never returned to England. Really, MacGregor's scam hadn't worked out so well for him. He had spent a large amount of money advertising for the colony, arranging ships and buying supplies, but sentiment on South American investment turned before he made much money. Still, he tried to float a second loan in October. His bonds quickly became worthless. Reports had already arrived that the Mosquito King had revoked his grant, but more importantly, the settlers were about to arrive. He announced that his wife was unwell and left for Italy. The speculative investments in Poyais and other South American countries was a significant part of what precipitated a major stock market crash in 1825. 70 banks failed in the crash. There, MacGregor kept up his efforts to fundraise using Poyais. He teamed up with a group of merchant adventurers, offering to allow them to handle the land. In August, he published a new constitution, making Poyais a republic, although he remained cazique and worked on offering yet another loan. Fortunately for the French adventurers signing on, the French government refused their applications and embargoed the ship. 2 of MacGregor's associates were arrested on suspicion of attempted fraud. MacGregor himself remained in hiding until he was captured in December. 2 trials were held in 1826, one in April and then a second when the French finally extradited the Frenchman at the head of the adventuring company from Belgium. Ultimately, MacGregor and his associates were cleared of wrongdoing. Only the Frenchman was convicted. Even then, MacGregor didn't give up. He now claimed he had been elected cazique and so needed no land grant. He dropped his royal pretensions, but continued to try and sell land and even float another, even larger loan. Returning to England, he ended up in jail briefly for debt, and again a handbill appeared after the loan was issued, calling it another Poyais humbug. He seems to have finally given up selling Poyaisian land only in 1837. Josefa, Princess of Royals, died in 1838, and MacGregor left Scotland for Venezuela. Bolivar was long dead, and successfully received recognition of his military rank and back pay. He died in 1845 and was given a military funeral, his name inscribed on the monument of the liberators.
MacGregor never showed much remorse for the dead colonists, nor did he ever again go to visit Poyais. His commitment to the scheme was downright bizarre, in that he continued to try to raise money off of it long after it made any sense. Biographer David Sinclair argued that possibly MacGregor had come to believe his own lies. Sinclair says perhaps the greatest tragedy is the area might have been able to sustain a thriving colony if only MacGregor had sold it for what it actually was. Some historians argue that MacGregor really did want to have a successful colony, but that's kind of hard to believe given the extent of his lies. His fraud has often been described as one of the most brazen in history.
I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.